Hi, everyone. It was clear to me that I wanted to focus on Joseph's coat, which appears, of course, in this week's Parsha, Parashat Vayeshev. But it actually doesn't call this coat the amazing Technicolor dream coat, we know, but rather all it tells us in the psukim are as follows. Vayisrael ahavet Yosef mikol banav, and Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph above all of his other sons. Why? Kivens kunim hulo, because he was a child that he had in his old age. So what did he do? Va'asalo, and Jacob made for him a ketonet pasim. Those two words, those are the only two words we have to work with. He made him a ketonet pasim. Now, the problem is both the word ketonet and the word pasim are somewhat unclear how to interpret or translate these words. So, of course, one way to understand, to try to understand the meaning of unclear words in the Bible, in the Tanakh, is to see if they appear in any other context in the Bible that can shine a light on what these words could mean. So the expression ketonet pasim appears in one other place in the Tanakh, and it appears in a very sad, disturbing story in Sefer Shmuel, Shmuel Bet, the story of Tamar and Amnon. In that story, Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, and after the terrible event, it tells us, so his servant put her out and bolted the door behind her. It continues, she was wearing a ketonet pasim. Why? For this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe that she was wearing. So this text gives us a little more insight into what this ketonet pasim might have been. Clearly, it was some kind of royal garment, presumably one that was very valuable or ornate. Notably, both Tamar's and Joseph's garments end in tragedy, right? They both end essentially being torn. Of course, our traditional commentators have disputed how to translate the expression ketonet pasim. What is it about this ketonet pasim that made it special? So basically, the interpretations fall into three separate categories. One is that what made it special was what it was made out of, the fibers that were used. Rashi says that it was made out of clean white cotton wool. Saadia Gaon, for example, says that it was made out of silk. But either way, wool or silk possibly, right, were materials that were reserved for clothing worn by upper class citizens on special occasions. Okay, so it was made out of fancy fibers. The second category is that what made it special was not necessarily the material, but rather the style. And it focuses on the word pasim, which in modern day Hebrew we interpret as stripes or lines, but the Rashbam and others say that pasim is referring actually to its length, that it reached pas yado, or maybe even also pas raglo, to the wrist or the ankle. And that length was an indicator of prominence. Why? Because long sleeves and long tunics were a sign that one didn't have to work, right? Laborers, people who worked in the field, who worked with animals, right? They have to wear short garments. But a person of high status or royalty, he demonstrated his position by wearing long sleeves and long tunics, right? And the implication of this, right, of Yaakov gifting such a garment to Joseph, wouldn't be lost on his brothers, right, who are sent away to go work with the animals, while Joseph luxuriates at home in his fancy clothes. So that's category number 2. And the final category is really the one that gets the closest to the most popular notion that this was a multicolored coat, which it doesn't say in the text. And that is that what made it special was a unique pattern. So the Ibn Ezra, for example, says that pasim means that it was embroidered with some kind of designs, maybe checkered or plaid or even pictures, images, which we actually have examples of from ancient Egypt. Alternatively, the Radak says that pasim means that it was made up of different pieces, each piece in a different color. And that's really the closest we have to the multicolored coat, a kind of patchwork of vibrant colors. Now, of course, based on all of this, there are many artistic representations of Joseph's coat, but I just wanted to bring a few today that were particularly interesting to me, and they happen to all be representations by Israeli artists. So let's just look at a few. So the first is by an Israeli painter who was actually born in Milano, Italy. And I like, these are both by the same artist, just one in black and white and one in color. And I just sort of like the whimsical, sort of fun nature of these paintings. And I love the way she turns the neckline of the coat into the pit that Joseph was thrown into by his brothers. And of course, later also into the prison in Egypt. As you know, as if to suggest that she is incorporating all the different stages of Joseph's life and how the royal garment actually caused his downfalls and caused his sorrows. So that's Sabina Saad's interpretation. The next one is not a painting, but a photograph. Adi Nis is a very popular Israeli photographer that has a series of photographs of contemporary photographs that are sometimes he uses the tradition of old European masters, but he essentially is reinterpreting the biblical stories with contemporary models, right? And I brought a bunch of examples, not the Joseph example, but a bunch of examples for anybody who's not familiar with his style, right? Especially for Israelis, by doing this, he really the characters of the Bible really come to life, right? As if they're walking amongst us today, because all of them are shot, all of these photographs are shot in marginal sections of Tel Aviv. And the themes of homelessness and being an outsider are very prominent. It's just if you can see some of these examples, like the guy with a bunch of old men, right, who look like a bunch of old taxi drivers hanging out at the lotto stand in Tel Aviv. So he entitles that Job and his friends. Okay, so he puts that biblical story in a contemporary setting, envisions what it would look like in our eyes. The one next to it is Ruth and Naomi. The one below Ruth and Naomi is Esav selling his Bechorah to Yaakov for a bowl of soup, and the setting is in a contemporary food kitchen, a soup kitchen. Next to that, he with the older man pushing a cart is entitled Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. So a very contemporary interpretation of the father-son relationship. And below that, the elderly homeless man is his version of Elijah, the prophet. So you get a little sense of his style, the style of Adi Nis. And the picture that I have here in large is entitled simply Joseph. And in this version of Joseph, Adines doesn't emphasize the royalty or the chosenness of his character, but actually his ordinariness, right? And his sort of fragility. He's the youngest child who is about to be attacked or bullied by his brothers. And he's just a kid standing alone on a street in a striped shirt. So that is a really fun interpretation. And then next, I wanted to bring, this is out of chronological order in terms of when these artists lived, but this is actually a very, very famous piece of Israeli art by artist Michael Skan Kohen, who combined Jewish and Israeli symbols in his conceptual art. In this Coat of Many Colors, which is his title, it's not a very good picture, sorry, that I brought here, but you can look it up online. The head is actually a self-portrait. It's somewhere between a hippie and a prophet, which he might have seen himself as some combination of the two. And the gown, right, even though he calls this painting the Coat of Many Colors, there are not many colors here, right? There's only blue and white. And of course, blue and white stripes may remind us of many things, may remind us of the talit or the stripes of the Israeli flag, of obviously Joseph's coat, but also possibly the stripes of the prison uniforms from the Shoah, from the Holocaust. We don't know. Notably, there's really no body or hands or feet of this figure. And maybe it begs the question, is Joseph the chosen one or the one thrown into the pit? Right? Is Israel the chosen people or the one thrown into the concentration camps? Right? In the end of the story, Joseph rises, as do the Jewish people, through establishing the state of Israel. Right? So he's playing with, possibly with all of these different concepts, all of these lows and highs, both in the private character, personal character, and in the life of the nation. There's a lot there. Okay. This is again by an Israeli artist named Ovadia Agassi, who was originally from Iraq, but came to Israel in the 50s. And this is really different than anything we've seen. He was very inspired by micrography, the Jewish art of making pictures out of Hebrew words and letters and psukim and verses. And that's really what you have going on in all of his artwork. I have two just examples on the top that are of Moshe and of Yosef blessing Menashe and Ephraim, but the one obviously that we're focusing on is of Joseph's coat. And I just think it's amazing. He had a really interesting technique. He would like throw a whole thing of paint on a canvas and then essentially write all the Hebrew letters that he wanted to write. Around Joseph's coat are verses from this week's Parsha with a special tool. And you are forced to look closely, right, in order to decipher the text and its connection to the image. And I think what's most notable about this is the picture right before, the coat of many colors was not many colors, it was blue and white. And here, clearly it's not blue and white and it's not many colors, it's only red, which may be a reference to Joseph's coat that is ultimately dipped in blood. And all of this he does in essentially a 3D, right? All of these elements, it's hard to see, sorry, but all of these elements are above the painting. Okay, so we looked at Agassi, we looked at Skan Kohen, we looked at Adi Nis, and we looked at Sabina Saad. So I wanted to end just with one fun painting illustration that is certainly not Israeli, but is fun nonetheless, and that is Joseph Katz and his coat of many colors. This is an illustration by none other than Dr. Seuss. And he created all of these illustrations that were only produced after he died. And this one sort of combines lots of great things about Dr. Seuss, about his love of cats, and in color and patterns. Kind of silly. In terms of a personal project to go along with this week's Parsha, in the past, I've done really fun collaborative projects with kids, really, really, really simple, that every kid basically gets a square of felt. They usually sell, I assume they do in America, because if they even do in Israel, felt in these squares, in these already pre-cut squares. And I want the kids to work with something resembling fabric, right? Material, not paper, not just paper, which we usually work with. So every kid gets a square. Unfortunately, we don't usually have time to sew, and I don't know how to sew. I don't really know how to sew. So I always cheat, just like I do when I make my kids perm costumes. Hot glue gun. But with kids, you could just use a regular liquid glue, which they always, unfortunately, like to use. Where's my example? Hold on. Oh, here we go. You know what, I'll, no. So I would love to make the fabric, I would love to make like the patchwork quilt that you see in the picture, but that's not going to happen in my personal life or in my classroom. So instead, we usually work with felt. Here, I'll stop sharing. And this is just, you can't really tell the texture, but this is just a piece of felt, and cut out all different size squares and rectangles and give it out to the kids. Honestly, I did this one myself and it was really fun. And then ultimately what I would do is, put them all together, all the squares together that would have all been decorated. And it looks like patchwork, and it looks like a coat of many colors, and it looks like a quilt. So I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat Chanukah, and may this Shabbat bring a lot of light into all of our lives. Shabbat Shalom. Light and color.